Chapter 2. The War in the Distance, The Play at Home. On July 29, 1914, Hunter began his first day at preschool. The day after the First World War broke out in Europe, the newspapers wrote about the shooting in Sarajevo, about troops being mobilized, about a world in chaos. But in Gogol, in a neighborhood that smelled of sawdust and freshly baked bread, the world was still. Hunter, 3 years old and wearing his best knitted sweater and hat with a tassel, held his mother's hand tightly as they walked through the gate to the small preschool on the outskirts of town. It was a red wooden building with white knots and a large yard where children were already running around in wild circles. A girl threw an apple into the air, a boy stood with a wooden sword and shouted attack. At a bush, "Come on, little friend," Signe said softly. "You're going to play with other children today." Hunter said nothing. He stared at the children, at the teacher who stood with a pipe in the corner of her mouth and a book under her arm. Everything felt too big, too loud, too much. He let go of his mother's hand, took a step, stopped and began to fiddle with the string of his cap. But only a few hours later he was sitting in the sandbox building a sandcastle with a boy named Tur. Tur talked like a parrot and always had snot under his nose, but he dug with great enthusiasm and called Hunter captain. The two of them formed a castle with moats, towers and even a pit where the prisoners would sit. "We must have a place where the enemy can hide," shouted Tur. "The enemy gets no food," Hunter grumbled seriously. Such were the days at preschool. Mornings began with songs in a semicircle, Twink Little Star and Be Vita Lamb, before Miss Steiner, who smelled of lavender and always had red cheeks, showed pictures of animals or told fairy tales. Hunter liked the fairy tales, especially those heroes riding into the forest and defeating trolls, but sometimes he didn't listen. Sometimes he sat at the back and drew swords in his notebook, or stared out the window, towards the forest that bordered the schoolyard. There was something about the forest that drew him. After lunch, which consisted of porridge, potatoes, or sometimes pancakes, the children were allowed to play outside. That's when the wild games began. Tur and a few other boys played tag, chasing each other around the yard until someone fell and cried. Once Hunter ran so fast that he ran straight into a fruit tree, got a branch in his eye and was carried home by Miss Steiner. But the next day he was back, with a bandage on his cheek and even more runny nose in his legs. Even so, he wasn't always there. Some days he would just sit by himself under a tree. He would sit for hours digging with a stick, or carving a piece of bark as if it were a miniature sword. Miss Steiner would come by and say, "You don't want to play with the others today, Hunter." He usually didn't answer, he just shrugged his shoulders. He liked the children, but he didn't always understand them. They laughed at strange things, like when someone farted or fell. Sometimes when he said something serious, about war, about trolls, about being a captain like his grandfather, they laughed at him. "You're strange," a boy named Alfred had said. "I'm not strange," Hunter had replied. "I'm just me." But it wasn't always lonely. Some days it seemed like everything was right. Then he ran through the forest with Tur and a girl named Maha, who wore braids so stiff they swung like ropes. They chased each other between the tree trunks, built huts out of branches, and proclaimed themselves kings and queens. "You are Night Hunter," shouted Maha. "Protect us from the wicked goat." The wicked goat was actually Miss Stina's old pet, a lame goat named Jijta, who sometimes went wild and ate the children's drawings. Hunter, armed with a stick, laughed so hard he squinted as he ran after Jijta and shouted, "The enemy is fleeing." It was moments like these that made preschool life magical. But sometimes, when it rained and the children were inside, forced to draw or stack blocks, Hunter became restless. He wanted to go outside, wanted to run, feel the wind in his face. Once he slipped out the kitchen door, ran around the house, climbed over the fence and hid in the woods. It took Miss Steiner and two older boys over an hour to find him. He was sitting on a stump, staring at a dead bird. "Why do birds die?" he had asked quietly when they arrived. Steiner had just hugged him tightly and said, "Because they live, little friend, because they flew," and so it was. Between the play and the laughter, between the jumping and the running, there was always a sad streak in Hunter. Maybe it was the memory of Uncle Oscar, whose name he bore. Maybe it was something else, an innate sense of the seriousness of life amidst the carefreeness of childhood. When Hunter was 5, in 1916, he was already a little man in a boy's body. He could tie his own shoes, light a candle, climb trees, and carve little boats out of bark. He knew that the war was still going on far away, that boys became men and men died. But he also knew that the sun still rose over Giggle every morning, and that the forest was waiting. On his last day at preschool, he was given a little book by Miss Steiner. On the first page it read, "To Hunter, the night in the forest, with a heart bigger than the whole world. Never forget to play, never forget to feel," and he smiled. Because even though he didn't always understand the other children, he knew one thing, that he was on his way. On his way somewhere bigger, and the game was just the beginning.